One evening, I came home to an eerie feeling, something I couldn't quite place, but unsettling all the same. Eileen and I had been married for years, and I trusted her completely. She wore her hijab proudly, a symbol of her faith and our shared life values. Yet lately, things had felt different. Small signs I couldn't ignore anymore. She'd been distant, distracted, and sometimes seemed far away, even when sitting right beside me. On that particular evening, I noticed she was still out. This wasn't entirely unusual, as she had recently started attending a new language course in the evenings. She was becoming more social and engaging with people from different backgrounds, often sharing stories about new friends and their cultures. Still, something about the situation nagged at me, so I decided to take a walk near her class and pick her up as a surprise. As I got closer, I saw her outside the building, but she wasn't alone. A man I'd never seen before stood with her. He was tall, with a confident air that contrasted sharply with Eileen's usually reserved nature. They were standing close, laughing, her face visible, hijab slightly loosened in a way I'd never seen before. I froze, confusion and anger battling within me as I watched. Before I could fully process the situation, I saw him reach out and gently remove her hijab, brushing his fingers along her hair. She didn't resist. Instead, she smiled, her eyes shining in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to look away, to erase the image, but I couldn't. The man leaned in close, his voice soft, whispering something that made her giggle. The ease with which she let him handle her like that, in a way so intimate. I felt a betrayal so deep it was like a punch to my stomach. As they spoke, their words and laughter mingling in the cool night air, I struggled to reconcile this image with the woman I thought I knew. This wasn't just some innocent interaction, this was something I couldn't ignore. The days that followed were filled with a constant, heavy tension, lurking just beneath the surface of our home. Every time I looked at Eileen, I felt a strange mix of longing, bitterness, and hurt. Her laughter, once my source of happiness, now felt like a taunt. I kept replaying that scene in my mind, the way she'd let that man so casually touch her, as if her hijab, a symbol of our bond and trust, meant nothing. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not yet. I needed proof, something undeniable. Our intimate life had been dwindling for some time, but now it was as if she were avoiding even the simplest touch. Every attempt I made to be close to her felt like I was reaching for someone already far away. And the more she pulled away, the more I became convinced she'd already crossed that line with him. She was drifting further and further, but she kept her distance with a quiet ease, a practiced indifference that only fueled my suspicion. So, I decided to follow her. A few days later, she left the house with her usual calm, telling me she was off to her language class. As soon as she stepped outside, I slipped into my car, parked discreetly down the street and watched as she hailed a cab. The air felt thick, my pulse hammering as I waited to see where she was headed. The cab made its way downtown, eventually pulling up outside a quiet, upscale cafe, its outdoor seating secluded from the street. I parked a few spots down and stayed in the car, watching as Eileen stepped out and lingered on the sidewalk. And then, just as I suspected, he appeared. The same man from before. They greeted each other with a familiarity that stung, his hand resting on her shoulder as they exchanged hushed words. Eileen laughed, her voice mingling with his, and I felt a fresh surge of anger and jealousy tightening my chest. She leaned in close, her gaze so warm and open, as if he were someone she'd known for years. They slipped into the cafe, and I followed, finding a spot in the corner where I could keep an eye on them without being seen. The two of them looked like any couple, sharing a comfortable intimacy that should have been ours. My fists clenched under the table as I watched the way she leaned toward him, listening intently to his every word, smiling in ways I hadn't seen in months. It was as though the version of Eileen I knew had been left behind entirely. After a while, the two of them got up, and I quickly moved out of the cafe, positioning myself across the street as they walked side by side down the sidewalk, her laughter carrying faintly through the air. They stopped at a nearby hotel, and my stomach turned as she followed him inside. I waited, each passing second a knife twisting deeper. I had suspected, but seeing it was a different kind of pain. An hour later, she walked out, her expression slightly flustered but pleased. She took a moment to adjust her hijab, looking around as though to make sure no one she knew was nearby, and I felt a new resolve harden within me. As I drove home, I forced myself to think clearly. I needed more than just suspicion and shadows to confront her. The following weeks were some of the longest and most grueling of my life. I found a way to place a GPS tracker in her purse, and whenever she left the house, I'd watch her movements on my phone, each dot marking her whereabouts like a wound reopening. Time and again, I saw her go to the same locations, the cafe, the hotel, and other places where they would meet in secret. Each notification was a reminder, a cold slap of betrayal that only deepened the emptiness growing between us. At home, I kept up the facade, biting back every question, every accusation, as I tried to gather more proof. The distance between us grew like a canyon. She was slipping further and further away, yet somehow it seemed to go unnoticed by her. I wondered if she even cared. I'd see her sitting quietly, lost in thought with that faint, mysterious smile, a smile I realized wasn't for me. Then, one night, I made up my mind. I needed to end the charade, to finally confront her with the truth I could no longer keep to myself. That evening, I waited until she came home, quietly watching as she entered the house, her eyes distant as usual. I waited until we were alone in the living room, every word poised on the edge of my tongue. "Eileen," I said, my voice calm but with an edge I knew she would recognize. She paused, looking at me with a brief flicker of surprise. "I think we need to talk." She looked at me, her face composed, but I could sense her unease. She shifted, looking at the floor as if expecting this moment. "Talk about what?" she said quietly. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady as I looked her in the eyes. "Where have you really been going these past few weeks?" The question hung in the air, the weight of it making the silence almost unbearable. Her gaze dropped, her fingers nervously fidgeting as if weighing her response. I told you." "Language classes," she replied, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Don't lie to me, Eileen." The firmness in my tone seemed to shake her. I could see the walls crumbling, her composure unraveling as she searched for words. She opened her mouth to say something, but then closed it, as if realizing there was no escape, no way to deny the truth any longer. I felt a surge of anger, disappointment, and a deep, aching sadness as I waited, my patience wearing thin with every passing second. Finally, she looked up, meeting my gaze with eyes that had once been my refuge but now held nothing but guilt and shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was no apology in her tone, just a quiet admission of something she'd tried so hard to hide. Her words hung heavy in the air, and in that moment, I knew everything had changed. The idea of revenge settled in me slowly, like a creeping shadow I couldn't ignore. I knew it wasn't right, that it would only drag both of us down. But as I watched her every day, saw the slight, self-satisfied smile that hinted at a hidden life, at something I wasn't a part of, I couldn't stop myself. I wanted her to feel the humiliation I had been living with, the shock, the shame. She had slipped out of our shared life so easily, erasing our memories and our bond as if they meant nothing. It hurt, knowing that the person who had once been my confidant, my partner in life, could turn her back on everything we had shared. She continued her charade at home, still putting on the mask of a devoted wife, but I saw her real self now, the one who could go behind my back without a shred of remorse. I decided I needed to bring her back to reality in the cruelest way I could. In the weeks that followed, I went through the same routines. I'd watch her head out, study her movements on the GPS tracker, and when I felt ready, I'd follow her, careful to keep my distance. I began planning each step meticulously. I needed to catch her in a moment that was undeniable, something that would prove her betrayal not just to me, but to her family. One evening, I followed her to the same quiet cafe where she always met him. I watched from across the street as they sat together, their heads close, his hand casually brushing hers as they shared what looked like quiet, intimate conversation. My hands shook, my anger barely contained as I snapped pictures from the street. They weren't close enough to be compromising, but it was a start. I kept clicking, every small interaction etched in my memory as proof of what she had become. But it wasn't enough. I needed more, something that showed her with her guard down, exposed. I kept coming back, each time carefully positioning myself to avoid suspicion. It was risky, and my heart would hammer with the fear of being seen, of tipping her off before I had enough to confront her. She'd check her phone every now and then, as if checking the time or responding to a message, and each time, I braced myself for her to look my way. But she didn't. She was completely absorbed, her attention fixed on him, and that fact alone stoked my jealousy even more. After a few weeks of collecting evidence, the perfect opportunity came one night when I saw them make their way to the nearby hotel. My heart pounded, my hands cold with sweat as I watched them slip inside, the door closing behind them. It was now or never. I managed to find an adjacent building with a view of the room they had entered, though it took some doing. As I crouched on the dimly lit staircase across the way, I felt a sickening thrill mingling with my rage. I steadied my camera and waited, each passing minute stretching out painfully, until finally, they appeared near the window, their silhouettes visible through the thin hotel curtains. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their gestures, their movements, were enough. His hands slid up her arms, his fingers tangled in her hijab. She made no move to stop him. In fact, she was smiling, allowing him to unwrap it as if it were nothing more than a casual scarf, the symbol of our trust and her modesty discarded in seconds. I zoomed in, snapping picture after picture as he pulled it away, revealing her hair, loose and free. A part of me wanted to shout, to storm into that room, to tear her away from him. But I held back. I had my proof. More than enough to send a shockwave through her life and mine, to reveal her betrayal to her family and make her face the consequences of what she'd done. The next morning, while she went about her day, oblivious to the ticking bomb I was holding, I began gathering everything. I compiled each photo carefully, making sure each one was framed in a way that left no doubt. I edited the series, arranging them from their meetings at the cafe to the final, damning images at the hotel. The slow progression of her betrayal was now laid bare, captured in vivid detail. I took one last look at the images and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for us. This wasn't the love I had thought we'd built together. But she had destroyed it, and I had to remind myself of that. I wrote a simple message to her family, attaching the images with cold detachment. I thought you should see what Eileen has been doing, and who she has become. Maybe you'll understand why I can't continue in this marriage. The next few moments felt surreal. My hand hovered over the send button, my mind flooded with the memories of our life together, all the moments of happiness, of hope. But those moments had been tarnished, and there was no going back. With one steady breath, I clicked send. It was done. The fallout was swift. Within a day, her family had seen the photos. She hadn't come home that evening, so I wasn't there to witness her first reaction. But I received a message from her brother, a simple text that said, "Thank you for showing us the truth." I knew that word would spread. I could imagine the looks of horror, the shock and disbelief among her family and friends as they saw what she had done, the ultimate betrayal, her hijab removed by another man's hands. And as painful as it was, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. I had made her pay. I had shattered the life she thought she could have in secrecy. The fallout hit her harder than even I had anticipated. She came home late that night, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. I could tell she'd been crying, maybe for hours. She didn't speak at first, didn't try to defend herself. She just looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, one of total desperation, a vulnerability so raw that, for a moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity. But that pity quickly vanished when I remembered the betrayal, the way she had smiled with him, how she had let him unravel her, piece by piece, her hijab removed like a secret revealed. I hardened myself, meeting her gaze with cold indifference. I waited for her to break the silence. "Jack," her voice was barely a whisper, thick with pain. She swallowed, seeming to gather herself, then stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly together. "Please, delete the photos." Her voice wavered, and her hands began to tremble. "Tell them it wasn't me, that it was all just a misunderstanding." She reached for my arm, her grip surprisingly tight, pleading with me to listen, to give her a way out. I could feel the dampness of her tears on her hand as she clung to me, her desperation pouring out with every word. "Tell them it was a joke," she choked out, struggling to hold back the tears that kept falling. "Tell them it was a stupid prank, tell them I was just doing it because you dared me to. Tell them anything, but please, don't let them believe this is who I am. They'll never look at me the same way. They'll never forgive me." I watched her, expressionless, listening as she spun a web of excuses, each more desperate than the last. She seemed to be trying every possible angle, grasping at any excuse that might make her actions seem less real, less damning. I could see the fear in her eyes, the horror she felt at knowing her family, her closest friends, had seen the side of her she'd kept hidden. The thought of being judged, of being condemned in their eyes, seemed to shatter her more than anything else. She let go of my arm, stumbling back a step as she continued to plead, her voice thick with sobs. "I'll do anything you want, just tell them it's not true. I'll say it was photoshopped, that it was all a game, that you were just playing a trick because we had this bet. Please, Jack, just tell them it's a lie." The irony wasn't lost on me. After all her lies, all the months she'd spent sneaking around, deceiving me, now she was begging me to tell one last lie to protect her from the consequences. Her tears, her frantic attempts to rewrite the story, would have moved me once. But now, they just felt hollow. "Do you think it's that simple?" I said, my voice cold and low. "You think one lie will undo everything you've done?" She sobbed harder, her hands covering her face as if she could somehow hide from the truth. "Please," she whispered again, her voice so broken it was barely audible. "I'll do anything, Jack. I'll make this right. Just, don't let them think of me this way. Don't let them believe I'm this kind of person." "And what kind of person are you, Eileen?" I asked, leaning in, my words biting. "The kind of person who cheats? The kind of person who betrays her own family? Or the kind of person who begs for forgiveness only after she's caught?" She shook her head, her sobs coming in shuddering waves. "No. I'm not. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just... I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I scoffed, feeling the anger boiling up again. One night might be a mistake. But this? Meeting him over and over, letting him touch you, letting him, my words caught in my throat, a fresh wave of disgust surging through me. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Eileen. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." She flinched at the harshness of my tone, her face crumpling as she looked down, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, I felt the urge to turn away, to escape the rawness of her grief. But then I remembered the betrayal, the humiliation she'd inflicted on me, and I steeled myself, waiting for her to finish. "Please, Jack," she murmured again, her voice barely more than a whisper. I can't lose my family. I can't bear for them to look at me like that. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you. Just, tell them it was a joke. Say it was a prank, a silly mistake." I shook my head slowly, crossing my arms as I looked down at her. "So now you want me to lie for you? After everything you've done?" She looked up, her tear-streaked face pleading with me, her eyes wide with desperation. "Yes. Please. I'll do whatever you ask. Just tell them it wasn't real. You can say it was part of a game we were playing, that I was just going along with it because I lost a bet. Anything. Just, please, don't let them think this is who I am." I could see she was grasping at straws, her mind scrambling to find any excuse, any way to erase the damage she'd done. It was almost pitiful, watching her cling to the hope that a few words could undo the months of deceit and betrayal. But I wasn't moved. "What makes you think I owe you that?" I asked, my voice cold. "What makes you think, after all the lies, all the betrayal, that I should save you from facing the consequences of your choices?" She looked down, her hands clenching into fists as she fought to keep herself together. Because I know I've done wrong, Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I don't want my family to hate me. I don't want them to see me as some disgrace. Please, just give me a chance to make things right." I watched her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air, letting her feel the weight of what she was asking. She was begging me to carry her shame, to bear the burden of her lies so she could continue living without the consequences. And yet, despite everything, there was a small part of me that was tempted. But I couldn't do it. Not after all I'd seen, all I'd felt. Not after she had destroyed my trust, my love, my belief in the life we had built together. "Maybe you should have thought about that," I said finally, my voice low but unyielding. "Maybe you should have thought about how your family would see you before you chose to betray everything you claimed to value." Her shoulders slumped, the last glimmer of hope fading from her eyes as she realized the truth. There would be no escape, no way to undo what she had done. She was left to face the reality of her actions, the weight of the betrayal she had inflicted on me and on everyone who trusted her. I watched as she crumbled, her sobs filling the silence of our once peaceful home. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, was gone, replaced by this desperate stranger who would do anything to avoid the truth. And as I looked at her, I felt a strange sense of closure, a final, bittersweet release from the pain and anger that had consumed me. For the first time since I had learned of her betrayal, I felt a faint, flickering sense of peace. The moment Eileen's body slumped forward, collapsing into herself, it took me a second to realize what was happening. She had been pleading, her voice so frantic, so broken, but I never thought the weight of it would push her over the edge. Her fingers loosened from their desperate grip on my sleeve, and she crumpled, hitting the floor with a heavy, unsettling silence. "Eileen?" I knelt beside her, my pulse hammering as I shook her gently, but there was no response. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, as if every ounce of strength had drained from her. For a moment, I felt a deep pang of guilt, an instinctual urge to protect her, to hold her, to undo the pain that had shattered her composure. But I pushed it down. She was the one who had put us here, who had betrayed everything we shared. I reminded myself of that as I dialed the emergency number, yet there was a strange hollowness in my voice as I gave the operator our address, explaining that my wife had lost consciousness and needed help. The cool professionalism of the operator steadied me, guiding me through the steps as I checked her pulse, feeling the faint but steady rhythm beneath her skin. I stood up, moving away as I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching, each wail pulling me further from the anger and resentment I had carried all this time. I looked at her, crumpled on the floor, her face still streaked with the remnants of her desperation, her lips slightly parted as if she were still trying to find the words to beg, to bargain, to make sense of the damage. It was a sight that felt foreign, almost surreal. This woman lying here was a stranger, and yet she was the same person I had shared my life with. Minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and I stood back as they worked, watching as they checked her vitals, each procedure clinical and precise. They lifted her onto a stretcher, their hands steady and efficient, their words calm and measured as they asked me questions. I answered on autopilot, my voice distant, hollow. One of the paramedics glanced up, sensing the tension, but he didn't ask. They quickly stabilized her, and I followed them outside, watching as they loaded her into the ambulance. She looked small, fragile, as she lay there on the stretcher, her hijab slipping slightly to reveal strands of her hair. I didn't bother to fix it. Let her family see her this way, I thought bitterly. Let them know the truth. But as I stood there, the bitterness gave way to something I couldn't quite name, a strange emptiness that left me feeling as hollow as the night air around us. I climbed into the ambulance, my movements stiff and mechanical, settling into the seat beside her as they prepared to take us to the hospital. The paramedics asked if I was family, and I found myself nodding, the word husband slipping from my mouth as if it belonged to someone else. the ride to the hospital was silent, the dim glow of the ambulance lights casting long shadows across Eileen's face. I couldn't stop staring at her, studying the faint lines of exhaustion etched into her skin, the soft curve of her mouth, now slack and expressionless. She looked different, stripped of the fierce defiance and desperation that had consumed her moments ago. In this quiet, vulnerable state, she almost looked like the woman I had fallen in love with. When we arrived at the hospital, they wheeled her into the emergency room, leaving me in the waiting area. I found a seat, sinking into the cold, plastic chair, and stared blankly at the wall. The minutes dragged on, each one blurring into the next. A nurse occasionally glanced my way, offering a polite but detached smile, her gaze flickering with curiosity, perhaps picking up on the tension that seemed to cling to me. I tried to piece together everything that had happened, every word she had said, every tear she had shed. I could still see her on the floor, her eyes wide with terror, pleading with me to erase her shame, to shield her from the consequences she had brought upon herself. The memory played over and over in my mind, each detail sharpening the sense of betrayal that sat heavy in my chest. And yet, there was an ache beneath the anger, a rawness that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried. After what felt like hours, a doctor approached me, his expression professional but softened with a hint of empathy. He introduced himself, his voice calm as he explained that Eileen was stable, that she had likely fainted due to a mix of emotional and physical exhaustion. He told me they would keep her for observation, that she could go home in the morning. I nodded, barely absorbing the words. "You can go in and see her, if you'd like," he added, gesturing toward a room down the hall. I hesitated, a part of me resisting the idea of seeing her in this vulnerable state, the woman who had shattered our life together. But something compelled me to follow, to face her one more time. I walked down the sterile hallway, my footsteps echoing in the quiet, each step bringing me closer to a decision I wasn't sure I wanted to make. When I entered the room, she was lying in the hospital bed, her face turned away from the door, her body a small, crumpled shape beneath the thin blanket. The soft hum of machines filled the silence, a steady rhythm that felt oddly comforting in its predictability. I stood there, watching her, waiting for some sign that she was awake, that she was aware of my presence. After a moment, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, slowly focusing as she turned to look at me. Her gaze was hollow, her face pale, and I saw the faint flicker of recognition as she registered my presence. "Jack," her voice was barely a whisper, a tremor running through it. I'm sorry." I stared at her, the words catching in my throat. I wanted to tell her it was too late, that her apologies meant nothing, that I couldn't forget or forgive the betrayal she had inflicted. But as I looked at her, lying there, stripped of her defenses, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. "Rest, Eileen," I said finally, my voice steady but distant. "We'll talk when you're ready." I didn't know if I was ready myself, but the bitterness, the anger, felt like a weight I could no longer carry. I needed answers, yes, but I needed to understand why. How we had gotten here, and whether there was anything left to salvage. She nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears, but she didn't say anything more. She simply lay back, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling, as if lost in her own thoughts, her own regrets. And as I turned to leave, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, a burden that felt both inescapable and strangely freeing. As I walked out of the hospital, the night air was cool, the world around me quiet and still. I knew that the path ahead would be long and painful, that the scars of betrayal would take time to heal. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't expected, an emptiness, yes, but also a faint sense of possibility, a chance to rebuild, to find a way forward, whether with her or alone. And with that thought, I took a deep breath, stepping into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The ride home the next day was shrouded in an uneasy silence. Eileen sat beside me, her gaze fixed out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller, more fragile than I remembered, as if the weight of everything had finally taken its toll. I could see the remnants of yesterday's breakdown etched on her face, the swollen eyes, the remnants of tear tracks. She was subdued, silent, and I could feel her stealing glances at me, as if trying to gauge what was coming next. When we got home, I set our bags down, feeling the weight of all the things that were left unsaid. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, waiting for me to make the first move. I gestured for her to sit down on the couch, and after a moment of reluctance, she did. I joined her, taking a seat across from her, studying her face carefully. Finally, I broke the silence. "Eileen," I began, keeping my voice steady but firm, "I need you to tell me, what did I lack? What did I fail to give you? Where did I go wrong?" She looked down, her fingers twisting together in her lap. I could see the shame, the regret clouding her expression, but also a faint hint of defensiveness, as if she were bracing herself for what was coming. She took a deep breath, her voice barely more than a whisper when she finally answered. "It's not that you lacked anything, Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are a good husband. You were always there for me, you supported me in every way. But somewhere along the line, I don't know, I felt like I lost myself." Her voice wavered, and she took a shuddering breath. "It's not your fault. I let things get away from me." Her words hung heavy in the air, filling the space between us with a strange, bittersweet ache. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let myself accept that this wasn't about what I had or hadn't done. But another part of me, the part that was still raw from her betrayal, refused to let go so easily. "Eileen," I said, my voice steady but unwavering, "you say I didn't lack anything, that I was there, that I supported you. But then why him?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. I needed answers. I needed to understand how she could throw away everything we'd built, everything we'd shared, for someone else. She looked up, meeting my gaze with tear-filled eyes. I don't know. It was a mistake," she stammered, her voice breaking. "At first, it was just someone to talk to, someone who felt new, different. I thought it would be harmless, but I got caught up in something I couldn't control." Her confession stung, each word driving the knife a little deeper. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd trusted with my life, had let someone else into her heart, her life, our life. And now she was sitting here, telling me it was nothing more than a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But I wasn't ready to let her off so easily. "Eileen, this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't a one-time thing. You met him, time and again, while you kept me in the dark, lying, deceiving me. How many times did you meet him? How many times did you let him touch you, hold you, see you like I never could?" My voice trembled, but I held her gaze, forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. She flinched, looking down, and I could see the shame creeping into her expression. "I don't know. I don't know how many times," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I swear, Jack, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to hurt you." I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my anger in check, to not let it consume me. "Then end it," I said, my voice low but unyielding. "If you truly regret what you've done, if you want a chance to make things right, then end it. Cut him out of your life completely. Delete every message, block every number, and promise me you'll never see him again." She nodded, the fear and desperation in her eyes intensifying as she realized the gravity of what I was asking. But I wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice cold, steeling myself for what was coming next. "If you want me to delete those photos, if you want me to even consider telling your family that this was some prank, some mistake, you need to make a choice. Him or me. And this time, there are no second chances." Her breath hitched, and I could see the struggle in her expression, the conflict tearing at her. She knew what she had to do, but I could see the hesitation, the flicker of doubt that told me she hadn't truly let go of him. The thought of it filled me with a fresh wave of anger, a bitterness I couldn't contain. "You should have made this choice a long time ago, Eileen," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm giving you one last chance to make things right. And if you don't, I won't hesitate to show those photos, to tell your family, your friends, everyone, exactly who you've become." She let out a shuddering breath, her shoulders slumping as the weight of my words sank in. She looked up, meeting my gaze with eyes full of regret, of sorrow, of something that looked almost like acceptance. "I'll end it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll delete everything. I'll never see him again. Just, please, Jack, please don't destroy me." I felt a strange sense of satisfaction at her surrender, a small but bitter victory in the face of everything she had done. But at the same time, there was an emptiness that nothing she could say, nothing she could promise, would ever fill. "Show me," I said, my voice cold and detached. "Show me that you're ending it. Right here, right now." She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her phone. I watched as she opened her messages, scrolling through her contacts until she found his name. She stared at the screen, her expression one of sorrow and reluctance, but she pressed delete, removing every message, every call, every reminder of the life she'd tried to build in the shadows. When she was done, she looked up, her gaze hollow, defeated. "It's gone," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He's gone." But even as she said the words, I could see the faint trace of something in her eyes, a flicker of longing, of loss. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. She had made her choice, but the scars of what she'd done, the damage she had inflicted on our lives, would linger. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me as I stared at her, this woman who had once been my everything. I didn't know if I could ever truly forgive her, if I could ever look at her the same way again. But for now, I had my answer. "I'll delete the photos," I said finally, my voice devoid of emotion. "But don't think for a second that this erases what you've done. This is just the beginning, Eileen. And if you ever go back to him, if you ever break this promise, there won't be a second chance." She nodded, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clasped them together, as if she were trying to hold on to the last fragments of our broken life. And as I looked at her, I felt the weight of everything we had lost, everything we had destroyed. This wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't love. It was something darker, something colder, a truce, perhaps, but one built on the fragile foundation of shattered trust. We sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, each of us facing the emptiness that now lay between us. And in that silence, I felt the faint stirrings of something I couldn't quite name, a sense of finality, of closure, but also a sadness so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. For the first time, I realized that even if she kept her promise, even if she never saw him again, the life we had shared was gone. What lay ahead was something new, something uncertain, a future built on the ashes of betrayal and regret. And as I looked at her, I wondered if either of us would ever truly be able to find our way back.